scissors. Sorry, I don't have any. All right, so I want to talk about Israel. Before we talk about Israel itself, we have to talk about Zionism and the creation of the state of Israel in its meaning today. And we have to recognize, we should recognize that historically Jews have prayed for the restoration of Zion, hence Zionism. Zion is another name for Jerusalem. It's also, there's Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and that's why it's referred to often as Zion. It has always had a very important role in Jewish life. Famously, there's the Psalm, Al Narod Bavel, by the banks of the Bavel, the river, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu, there we sat and there we wept when we remembered Zion. And the famous line, if I forget Jerusalem, my right hand wither, my tongue cling to my mouth. And so after the Babylonian exile, the fact of the matter is not every Jew went back. Okay? So already at the very beginning, there were those who wanted to return to the land of Israel, and those who were satisfied to remain wherever they were at that time. And during the years of the Roman rule, we have the 68 CE, when we have the uprising against Roman rule, revolt against Rome, and the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, and then the 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt was probably much worse for the local inhabitants. And while Jews continue to live in the land of Israel, there has never been time there haven't been Jews somewhere in the land of Israel. It became difficult, and Jews spread out all over the world, as we talked about last week, that sweep around the Mediterranean and then northward into Poland and Eastern Europe today. Now, the rabbis of the Mishnaic era seemed to wanted to tamp down on those Jews who still push to revolt against Rome. You remember we talked about Hanukkah. One of the theories is why Hanukkah is not really dealt with in any detail at all in the Mishnah was that they wanted to prevent another catastrophe. So they downplayed the human effort to restore Israelite rule, Jewish rule to the land of Israel, and made it more of a divine, miraculous event in the future. And there's even a statement that forbids Jews to come en masse to Israel, the rabbi said. And they said that God, as it were, made an agreement with the nations of the world. The nations of the world would not destroy Israel, the Jewish people, and the Jewish people would not try to force a reconquest of the land of Israel. All right. So, and with that, with the nature of the history of the Jewish-Gentile relationship for the next 1,400 years, 1,500 years, where Jews generally were weak minority, at least in terms of military strength and numbers in the lands in which they lived. A more quietistic approach towards dealing with the world came to the forefront. It doesn't mean Jews are always peace-loving people. It doesn't mean that there weren't Jewish soldiers. There's a fact that some of the synagogues that were built in Poland had to be built almost like a fortress, and they could have a cannon placed on top of the synagogue to help defend the city. And Jews were expected, at least during certain parts of the Middle Ages, to defend the walls of the city that they were adjacent to. But the idea of a massive return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was not something they had on the front burner, but on the back burner. Yes, we pray for the restoration and the coming Messiah every day, but then there's realistic vision as well. Okay, it's probably not coming today. And of course, when Shabtai Tzvi and that whole business with the false Messiah also helped to dampen that kind of approach. But that doesn't mean there weren't always some kinds of things going on out there. And so when we think the story of Zionism, some begin the story of Zionism with a man by the name of Moses Hess. He was born in 1812 and died in 1875. He's regarded as the father of Zionist socialism. Just to give, you don't have to remember these details, but he was born in Bonn in Germany, and he remained there to be educated by his Orthodox grandfather when his father moved to Cologne for business reasons. And at 14, he joins his father in business. He studies philosophy at the University of Bonn, but did not graduate. And then he helped to found the first socialist daily newspaper in Cologne, and then becomes its Paris correspondent at the end of 1842, moves to Belgium. He was around during the revolutionary years in 1848, 49. He runs off to Switzerland. And eventually gets back to Paris in 1853, where he remains. So after his father's death, he and his inheritance provide the basis for an independent lifestyle, including marriage to his Christian companion, Sybil Pesch. So he's married to a non-Jewish woman. And he lives in Germany for a while, 1861 to 63, where he published his most famous work, Rome and Jerusalem, which is considered to be a classic of Zionist theory. Basically, what he's doing, he says, well, first of all, he has a clearly socialistic vision of the world. He was not a communist, but in those days you had all kinds of flavors of socialist, communists, and even still today, really. And he was influenced by Marx. And his own attitude towards the Jewish people changed several times during his lifetime, which is something we come across with a number of the early Zionists. In his 20s, he felt himself thoroughly German and believed that Jews should assimilate. Later, reacting to current events, he occasionally expressed compassion for his fellow Jews. And in Rome and Jerusalem, he talks about his return to his people. After personally suffering from anti-Semitism, he turned to the Jewish national concept based on his idea of race, espousing the view that Jews should preserve their national identity in exile while striving for their political restoration in Palestine. Since the Jewish religion was the best means of preserving Jewish nationality, he felt it should be left unchanged until the establishment of Jewish entity in Palestine, where a Sanhedrin would be elected to modify Jewish law. Okay? So he has this beginning kind of thoughts, but there's no action, no really push to put anything into effect. All right? So as life got worse and worse in Eastern Europe for the Jews, we began to have some of the early proto-active movements. In 1881 and 1882, there were pogroms throughout the Pale of Settlement. That's the part of Poland that was taken over by Russia, the Russian Empire, where Jews were limited to live. They had to live in that area, in the Pale of Settlement. And so there was a founding of what's called the Beit Yaakov, Lechu v'nelcha, the house of Jacob, let us go and let us go up. Come and go up. Referred to as Bilu, founded in Kharkov, Russia. I think Kharkov today is in Lithuania, in Ukraine, isn't it? It was always, the Jews never knew which country they lived in, which week, depending on the borders were. But all right, so the pogroms motivated them to seek a refuge. And so they thought the best way of finding a refuge was to establish farms in the land of Israel. Again, it's not really a clear, it's a movement to move to Israel, but it's not real. I don't think it's really, it's called a Zionist movement, but I think there's a limitation on what you would consider it that way. So you have what they call Chivat Zion and the Bilu movement, and this ended up with what is known as the first Aliyah. Now, the word Aliyah means going up. Okay, La'alot, to go up. And the rabbis always spoke of the land of Israel as if it were higher than anywhere else. So when you go to Israel, you're always going up. Okay? If you're on up in the Himalayas and you left from one of the mountains in the Himalayas, you're still going up to the land of Israel. Right? That's why the term Aliyah was used. So we said Aliyah to the Torah. We talk about an Aliyah to the land of Israel. And there were several different movements of Jews to Israel during the course of this time, and each one during a certain segment of history is referred to as an Aliyah. This is the first Aliyah. It doesn't mean Jews had come to the land of Israel before that, but it means that this was some organized groups of people. Between 1882 and 84, and then again in 1890 and 91, there was an influx of Jews to the land of Israel. Some 25,000 Jews moved to the land of Israel. They established 28 moshavot. Moshava is a cooperative settlement. No known lands, but they help each other out. I don't know necessarily the nature of each moshav, but it's not a kibbutz. It's not everything is owned together. It's individual ownership, but cooperative, and maybe in the harvesting process and what have you. We need a lot of people. And selling this was also so some 90,000 acres of land had been purchased. There were beginning of some urban settlements, especially in Jaffa, where 3,000 newcomers made their home. Hebrew was beginning to be a spoken language once again. You know, Hebrew, of course, has been the language of Judaism, of prayer, study, but not as a day-to-day language. And a man by the name of Eliezer ben Yehuda was given the crown of rebuilding modern Hebrew. He raised a child speaking only Hebrew. They claim as the first one. It wasn't. There are others throughout history that spoke Hebrew, and so he also had to come up with names or make words to describe instruments of their day and age that they didn't necessarily have a word for. Sometimes they were words that were created from traditional basic Hebrew basic roots. And sometimes they came from other sources, and especially today, now you got a mishmash of Hebrew words of ancient derivation like radio and sveter and sandwich, and others like machonit, mirpeset. All of these are Hebrew words. You don't say porch, right? A rakevet, not a train. Right? So they would all be based upon Hebrew roots. And he tried to come up, but some of those are still around. He had a dictionary. And if you use that dictionary, people today would probably laugh at most of your Hebrew. Right? But still some of it stuck. And And so during this whole period of time, there were various efforts to support Jews moving to the land of Israel. Now, there already were Jews there, especially in Tzfat and Jerusalem and Tiberia, right? But these were mostly referred to later on as the old Yishuv. They were pious Jews. They often, their lives are often based upon receiving charity from outside the land of Israel. They were not interested in creating a vibrant state or anything like that. They, they went to daven, they went to study, they ate their meals and observed the yontivs, and that was their life. That's all they were interested in. I'm sorry, Tzfat is beautiful. Yes, it is. It's not very modern, no, but it has an avira, it has an air about it. That's why the mystics of Tzfat, that's where Yosef Karo and the Ari and Moses Cordovero and all of these mystics located themselves. Yeah, it's still and very artistic today too. They have a lot of artists who have settled in Tzfat.
Made was bread and cheese, and it was like the best thing I've ever had.
Okay. So there was some support for these various groups that came to Israel. Now, and a very important event, an element in this whole story, was the Alfred Dreyfus affair. Now, Alfred Dreyfus was a French Jew. He was a captain in the French army. He, of course, was his whole presence in the army was because of the degree of liberalization that had taken place in France during the different revolution of etc. But there always was an old guard that was often very anti-Semitic and certainly considered someone like Dreyfus to be an upstart and had no business being in the upper reaches of the military. And so after the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, as usual, you look for a scapegoat, somebody else who's responsible for it. And there was discovered that somebody had turned over secrets to the Germans. And so who was obviously guilty was the Jew. He certainly had to be the one who did it, because he's not really a Frenchman. Well, I think we're not Americans. We're not. In the case of Kanye, we're not Americans. Well, we may be people, but we're people. Yeah. Okay. And the Dreyfus trial was clearly a put up deal. The true culprit was really known already by some, but he was of an old French family, and he was able to escape responsibility. And Dreyfus was found guilty and sent off to Devil's Island. But during the trial, there were mobs in the street calling for the death to the Jews. Dreyfus's Judaism was Jewish background. He wasn't a very religious Jew, but his background of being a Jew was part and parcel of what was going on. And he becomes the cause célèbre between the left and the right in France. Okay. And the legend, it's probably not really 100% true, but I don't think it doesn't have some validity to it, was that Theodor Herzl, who we'll talk about more in a moment, was there in Paris during the trial, reported on the trial as a newspaper correspondent, and it influenced him to write a book later on called Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State. So let's talk about Theodor Herzl. He was born in 1860 and dies in 1904, so he doesn't have a long lifespan. He indeed is given the credit to be the founder of modern political Zionism. Political Zionism means not just thoughts in the air, but an approach to try and bring to fruition the creation of a Jewish state. Okay. So, first of all, he's born in Budapest, Hungary in 1860. He's educated in the spirit of the German Jewish Enlightenment. The family moves to Vienna in 1878. He gets a doctorate in law in 1884, works for a short time in the courts, but within a year he left law and devoted himself to writing, for which he has had a demonstrable ability from an early age. In 1891, he became the Paris correspondent for the New Free Press in Vienna, which was an influential liberal newspaper at the time. And so, as I said, he was in Paris to see what happened with Captain Dreyfus and the rise of anti-Semitism that resulted from the court-martial. And after considering a number of possibilities, including assimilation, he became convinced that the only solution to the Jewish problem, that's a strange formulation, but the Jewish problem and the solution versus the Nazis' final solution, Yimach Shema, was that there has to be a mass exodus of Jews from their places of residence. And originally he wrote it didn't matter where the Jews went. He didn't care. There was a time there was talk about founding a Jewish state, a community in Uganda. Thank God that didn't come to fruition. Okay. And eventually he what? It's just that the reality was, the thing is this, and why they came. There was always, somewhere. Jews come somewhere. There was a man by the name Baron de Hirsch, who settled Jews in agricultural communities in Argentina and other places in South America, who was not interested in Zionism. Because the thing is, Jews were endangered and they needed somewhere to go. So was just simply finding a refuge, which is what motivated some of these thoughts about finding a Jewish home somewhere else? Or was it tied in with the age-old longing for Zion? And eventually, even the non-religious elements of the Zionist movement understood that there was only one place for a Jewish state, and that was the historical home of the Jewish people. So he writes this book, he influences a lot of people, and he succeeded in convening the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. And the Congress adopted what is called the Basel Program and established the World Zionist Organization to help create the economic foundation for the proposed Jewish state. And it's important language here. We're not talking about Jewish settlement. We're talking about creating a Jewish state. Herzl was elected president of the organization and chaired the first 6 Zionist Congresses. And the rest of his life was spent running all over the place, meeting with world leaders, both Jewish and non-Jewish, trying to enlist financial and political support for his dream of a Jewish state. Right? And he dies in 1904, before, obviously his dream could come true. So he is the father, and what continues is the Zionist Community World Zionist Organization. Finally, again, there was another proposal. Britain has proposed using El Arish as a Jewish homeland. Should have had the Sinai then, wouldn't that have been great? And then came the Uganda suggestion. Well, the British at one time said El Arish. It was the British government that suggested Uganda. Don't forget, the European powers were very much involved in colonizing Africa during this period of time. But the Sixth Zionist Congress ultimately rejected any other possibility except settling in the land of Israel. Now, around 1904 begins what is known as the Second Aliyah. And that's given the lifespan of 1904 to 1914 when the war broke out, First World War. So there was a new upsurge of pioneering fervor. It didn't hurt that the Kishinev pogroms of 1903 and 2 years later also shook the Jewish communities. This Aliyah consisted of young men and women, mainly from Russia, and many of them imbued with socialist ideas. Socialism has a very strong element to the creation of the state of Israel and the political life of the state of Israel for many, many years until Menachem Begin became the first non-socialist prime minister of Israel. And so the young pioneers of this second Aliyah generally worked as hired laborers in the Moshavot. They established the first Jewish labor parties, Hapoel Etzion and Hapoel Hatzair, influenced by various spokespersons in the Zionist camp. And they founded the first kibbutz. And also they laid in 1909, they laid the foundation for the first all-Jewish city in the land of Israel at that time, Tel Aviv. In the sand dunes of the beaches, they came up with what now has become one of the classical Mediterranean cities. If you go to Tel Aviv and you substitute Italian or you substitute Greek or you substitute French for the Hebrew, you're in the same place in many ways, right? It's got that beach liberalism, various forms, attitude there. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's when I've been to Israel, I've gone to Tel Aviv 3 or 4 times. I go to Jerusalem, I go to the Galil, I go to the Negev. Tel Aviv, it's Tel Aviv, what's the big deal of Tel Aviv? Right? Although the first time I was in Israel as a kid, teenager, we went to Tel Aviv. That was more fun. So anyway, Tel Aviv is being set up. They were active in the beginnings of Jewish self-defense and established what was known as the Hashomer, the Watchmen's Association. And this Aliyah introduced Hebrew into all areas of life and helped really push towards making Hebrew the language. It wasn't clear what the language was going to be. The Alliance Universelle, the French Alliance, was active in communities throughout the Middle East, and so French was a challenger. Yiddish, of course, was a challenger. English, Arabic to some extent, but not a great extent. But by the end of this period, around the outbreak of the First World War, about 40,000 Jews had made Aliyah. Now, not everybody always stayed. Some of the people who came earlier had left because it was not always easy. Now, especially this wave of Aliyah was substantially different in many ways, and therefore this began to see the divide between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv. These are socialists. They were maybe not always so careful about sexual relations. They didn't observe Shabbat. They didn't necessarily keep kosher. Right? And so that's very different from what had been. So that already sets up some of the tension within the Jewish community between the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv. so and they were really pushing towards an economic basis of society based upon agriculture and of Hebrew. The old Yishuv either spoke Arabic or many of them who were from Eastern Europe spoke Yiddish. So yeah, we now come to a little bit of background about Eliezer ben Yehuda, the creator of modern Hebrew. Born in Lithuania in 1858, and after yeshiva education, he ceased being religiously observant. In the late 1870s, he concluded the future of the Jewish people was in Eretz Yisrael. He made Aliyah in 1881. So he published newspapers in which he argued the need for Hebrew culture and productive life. He was the first teacher of Hebrew in the country, and the first to insist that only be Hebrew spoken at home amongst the Yishuv. There's a slew of names and dates and things that we're not going to go into because I'm going to give you the overview of, and all these names just confuse everything. But it should be known that there were various factions within the Zionist world, secular socialists. Some were religious. Rabbi Joseph Sonnenfeld settled in Jerusalem in 1873, and he fought against introduction of any secular influences into the life of the Jewish community. And he was involved in a number of initiatives to develop Orthodox neighborhoods outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. But he was opposed to having any institutions come under the Zionist control. Okay. There was a Zev Tomkin, came from 1861 from Russia. He originally became a member of the Chibat Zion movement, and he opened an office in Jaffa. There he became involved in land purchase operations, coordinating the work of the new settlements. But ultimately, he left the country when he got some of his work didn't succeed. David Yellen, born in Jerusalem, 1864, an important Jerusalemite family of followers of the Vilna Gaon, arrived at the beginning of the same century. He was the first Ashkenazi pupil of the first Jerusalem school to teach secular studies, despite the threat by leaders of the Ashkenazi community to excommunicate his father for this action. Later becomes a teacher at the school and becomes involved in the efforts to promote the speaking of Hebrew and rebirth of Hebrew. It's interesting to note that there were aliyot from other places. Between 1908 and 1914, there was what they call the Yemenite aliyah. Jews from Yemen, very religious, very traditional minded, made a significant impact in moving to the land of Israel. Okay, now, one of the things that happens between 1914 and 1918, Palestine, as it was then known, was under the control of Turkey. Turkey sides with Germany and Austria in the First World War. Russia is on the side of the English and French. So, and since many of the members of the new Yishuv were actually a Russian background, they automatically became suspect to the Turkish authorities, and who kicked some of them out of the land of Israel. And indeed, we know there was a very famous group of Jewish spies who did indeed spy on behalf of the Allied powers. There were efforts, for example, to support the war effort, not on the English side. In 1915, there was known as the Zion Mule Corps, which was established by Joseph Trumpeldor in the British Army. Now, yeah, I never heard anything here about Jewish mule drivers, huh? No, Jews are stubborn, so I guess working with a mule makes perfect sense. What? The stiff-necked people. So anyway, if you're interested in world history and in the First World War, Paris 1919 was a great to read. For those of you who are interested in that sort of thing, because the author writes, she tells the story of what was going on in Versailles. Woodrow Wilson from the United States, the president of the United States, eventually got in the war. He was an idealist. Everything's going to be nice, and we'll get rid of all of the colonies, and the peoples can have their own lives and everything. And of course, the British and French were scheming behind Wilson's back to continue the old colonial style. And so during the war in 1916, there was what is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divides the Middle East into spheres of British and French influence. Right? So while the war's still going on, Turkey's not been yet defeated, but France and England are already divvying up the Turkish territories. And the French were supposed to take care of Syria, and the British were going to have Egypt, which they already had, and Palestine. Okay, and so and so you have Lebanon involved, Iraq, all of these countries there are going to be under either French or British influence. And the Zionist Congress worked with the British government pushing for a statement to support the founding of a Jewish state. And so in 1917, November 2nd, was called the Balfour Declaration, which His Majesty's government looks to the favorably upon the founding of a Jewish state, I think, in the land of Palestine. Right? So they're already hedging their bets. They weren't just going along with the Jews, they were worried about the Arabs as well. But by the time Versailles finishes, the British have this mandate to run Palestine. There's conflict at this time between the Jewish settlers and native Arabs. Sometimes it was because land did not necessarily belong to the local Arabs. They were held by owners in Turkey who sold it to the Jews. And so there was conflict as a result of that because some Arabs got pushed off land that they had used for pasturage or whatever. So there were conflicts, there was cases of bloodshed. The new Yishuv founded two important organizations, the Histadrut, which is basically the union of workers' union, and the Haganah. The Haganah is a self-defense organization. So now, between 1919 and 1923, we have what is labeled as the third Aliyah, mainly from Russia. It was partially a continuation of the second Aliyah that had been interrupted by the war. The Bolshevik Revolution also kind of pushed some people. And there were still other places to go. As my notes point out, there was still room, the United States was still open to immigration. So most of the immigrants who come at this time are consciously doing so out of clear Zionist ideas. Sometimes, as we'll see a little later on, when Jews flee Germany, they're going to wherever they can go. And the fact that the land of Israel was an opportunity for that was not necessarily because they were Zionists. Right? Just like a lot of Jews fled from Russia when the doors were finally opened and ended up in Israel, not necessarily because they really wanted to go there, but because that's where they could go. There was a lot of conflict and people wanting to go to different places. You can read David Bezmosic's book. He's got a couple of books about the Russian community that settled in Canada. He also and his wife were in this class many years ago. Okay. So in all, the third Aliyah brought in about 35,000 immigrants, about 53% from Russia, 36% from Poland, and the rest from Lithuania, Romania, and other Eastern European countries, apart from some 800 from Western and Central Europe. Right? As I said, these are mostly motivated people. 1921, there were riots in Jaffa, in which one of the famous Jewish writers at the time, Yosef Chaim Brenner, was killed. And in 1922 was the actual confirmed British mandate by the League of Nations to Britain. Now, the fourth Aliyah, between 1924 and 1928, in this immigration had a different social composition from its predecessors. There had been a drop in the inflow of pioneers, mainly because of the restrictions on departure from Soviet Russia. On the other hand, there was a rise in immigration of middle-class people, shopkeepers and artisans, mostly from Poland. And this was because of economic crisis in Poland and the fact that the United States had limited immigration to the United States. So where are we going to go? They were not interested in a new style of life. They weren't pioneers. They weren't farmers. They settled in towns, primarily in Tel Aviv, and they invested some of their small capital in workshops and factories, small hotels, restaurants, and shops. And so there was also significant rural development in the coastal plain. New villages based on citrus orchards were founded around the same time. Okay, so the fourth Aliyah brought in about 67,000 immigrants, half from Poland. 1924, the Technion was founded. 1925, Hebrew University was founded. One of the founders was not really a Zionist. He was more of a binationalist. 1926, there were riots in Hebron against the Jewish residents of the town, ending up with Jews being killed. 1929, Arabs riot in Jerusalem, massacres of Jews in Hebron again. So in 1930, what was known as the Hope-Simpson inquiry follows the recommendations of the Shaw Commission in analysis of land opportunities, which leads to, in October, the Passfield Second White Paper, the first attempt at British disengagement from the Jewish national home commitments of the Declaration and the Mandate, which limits Jewish immigration to Eretz Yisrael. So now, Britain had the mandate to help to create a Jewish homeland because of the pressure of Arab opposition and various other aspects of it. Britain starts to tries to weasel out some of these commitments, right? Including like limiting amount of immigrants. They felt if you limit the immigrants, and less Jews coming in, less conflict there will be with their Arab neighbors. 1933 through 1939 was the fifth Aliyah, initially from Poland, but later mainly from Germany and German-controlled territories. And the fifth Aliyah brought in over 250,000 Jews and transformed the character of the issue. The first Aliyah began with a small trickle in 1929, but in 1933, when Hitler rose to power in Germany, the trickle became a flood. In the period between 1933 and 1936, more than 164,000 Jews entered the country legally, while thousands of refugees came in as illegal immigrants. And so the German and Austrian Jews were over a quarter of the total and made an important contribution to the progress of the Yishuv. They constitute the first large-scale influx from Western and Central Europe. The majority of them, 80%, settled in the cities and towns, and their skills and experiences raised business standards and improved urban amenities. Over half of the newcomers made their homes in Tel Aviv. In Haifa, the construction of the first modern port was completed in 1933, and in Jerusalem, the Jewish neighborhoods were expanded. They provide a majority of the musicians who formed the new Philharmonic Orchestra, the Palestine Philharmonic. One of the great jokes is, you have to remember, Palestine was Jews. Palestinians were Jews. The Jerusalem Post, an English language newspaper, is called the Jerusalem Post today, but when it was originally founded, it was the Palestine Post. So the usage of the word Palestine, Palestinian, has had a very big change over the course of since 1948. So anyway, on the eve of World War II, the Jewish population in Palestine was 475,000, about 40% of the total population. So with the rise of Hitler, we start to bring in a lot of immigrants under the books or on the side. The Mossad was organizing clandestine immigration by various routes, sea and land. The British eventually put up a blockade, stopping some of these ships from coming in. So now, in 1936, there was an Arab revolt, an Arab general strike, and this led to what's called the Peel Commission. And Ord Wingate forms night squads for Jewish self-defense. In July of that year, the Peel Commission recommends the partition of Palestine between Arabs and Jews. The British government accepts this recommendation in principle. They had already cut off part of what was pre-mandate Palestine, what was known as Transjordan. Okay? That becomes given as a reward to King Abdullah, who got kicked out of Saudi Arabia. But the idea, which eventually comes up with the final partition plan to the United Nations in 1940, was this idea that where the majority of Jews would live, that would be a part of the Jewish state, where the majority of Palestinians lived, Arab Palestinians lived, that would eventually become the Palestinian state. In 1939, the third MacDonald White Paper rejects partition and envisages creation of two independent states. Right? So it's not parcels, but two states, one Jewish, one Arab. In September, the Second World War breaks out, and David Ben-Gurion famously said, "We shall fight the war as if there were no white paper, and the white paper as if there were no war." 1941, the Palmach was established, a fighting force within the Yishuv. We will talk about the Holocaust in more detail later on, but some of the Jews in Palestine were trying to bring in Jews from that area. Members of the Palmach were parachuted behind lines in Europe to try and help the Allied cause. And finally, in 1944, what was known as the Jewish Brigade was performed as part of the Jewish forces in World War II. Now, there were three major military groups in Israel at that time. There was the Haganah, which was represented the main part of the Jewish community of the Yishuv. And then there was Etzel and Lehi. And both of those were more right-wing, somewhat more extreme in their methods of fighting against both the Arabs and against the British. And so now 1945 through 46, they were temporarily united. In 1946, illegal Jewish immigrants were being deported to Cyprus, to displaced person camps, essentially like being put back in concentration camps. Here they escaped from the concentration camps and they end up back there. We have in 46, on July 22nd, the Irgun Etzel blows up a wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The British had their headquarters in the King David Hotel. There are two versions of the story. The Irgun claims they warned the British. The British claimed there was no warning. And so it was bombed and a number of Brits were killed. Some members of Etzel, this is the group that did it, were sentenced to death for their activities. And so Etzel grabbed two British sergeants and hung them in revenge. This tit for tat, bombs for bomb kind of thing was going on. So now we're up to 1947, which are some of the highlights. There's intermittent struggles going on. November 29th, the United Nations General Assembly votes for the partition of Palestine and a Jewish state. Okay, so in a vote at the United Nations, there was decided there would be two states. One would be Jewish and one would be Arab. Again, the idea was where majority of Jews lived, that would be part of the Jewish state. Where the majority of Arabs lived, that would be part of the Arab state. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city somehow, separate from everybody else. And the Jewish leadership accepted the partition plan. But the Arabs rejected it outright. And by really the war breaks out. After that, there is fighting, as some of the books, some of the sources, historical sources suggest, the earliest conflict could be called like a civil war. It was neighbor against neighbor, Jewish and Arab. This begins before the actual declaration of any independence. The May 14th, 1948, the British mandate expires and the Jewish state is declared. And there's an invasion from the neighboring Arab countries. The United States under Truman extends de facto recognition of the state of Israel, and and interestingly enough, the Soviet Union recognized de jure 3 days later. Right? So originally, the Soviet Union backed the creation of this Jewish state, and Sahal is created the Israel Defense Forces. And so you have an invasion, you have fighting between the nascent Jewish state and some of the local population and the invading armies. Egypt takes what is known as the Gaza Strip today. The Arab League under the Jordanians take what until 1967 and still is called the West Bank. There was a heavy fight for the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem, the suburbs that were to the east of Jerusalem, which I think were mostly Arab inhabitants anyway, were taken over by the forces of Jordan. And the western part of the city was held by Israel. There was some interesting phenomena, for example, where Hebrew University on Mount Scopus was surrounded, more or less cut off by the Arabs, but there was supposed to be permission for a convoy to go every so often up to carry supplies and stuff up to Mount Scopus. The armistice that was signed in 1949 in March ended the fighting, but it was not a peace treaty. The United Nations General Assembly votes in favor of an internationalization of Jerusalem, which nothing happened with that. The Jordanians are supposed to protect Jewish places of worship, which did not take effect. There was no peace, just an armistice. There was a brief armistice during the war in which both sides just built up their forces. Now, Israel undergoes a tremendous amount of expansion during the following years. Between 48 and 52, 648,000 Jews from the Arab lands come to Israel. Many of them are being kicked out by their hosts at the time. In essence, one can see this as an exchange of populations. Many of the Palestinians that had homes and farms and what have you in what became the state of Israel fled. Now, some fled to get out of the way of the fighting. Some were asked to do that by their Arab armies that were invading. Some just want to get away from the fighting, hoping to come back. And some were kicked out by the Israelis, especially in those cases where the villages could threaten you. Have you ever been, has everybody been to Jerusalem? Okay. You know, the main road to Jerusalem, there's hills on both sides, right? And one of the things in war, if you're on top and versus the guy on the bottom, you've got a distinct advantage. And so those villages that bordered the roads were always a threat to trying to get supplies to Jerusalem. And so a lot of those were pushed away. And it was unfortunately a fact of life. And I won't say that every village should have been kicked out. And I won't say that there weren't some that needed to be. There were atrocities committed by both sides. It used to be the way we were taught about the Israel war for independence was the Jews were the good guys and the Arabs are all the bad guys, end of story. It's more complicated than that. War is war. And war is hell, as Sherman once said. And bad things happen. Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, he was a general in the United States Army that invaded Georgia. William Tecumseh Sherman, yes. And Tecumseh? Tecumseh was an American Indian war chief. I don't know how he got that name, but he got Sherman got the name. And Sherman famously said that, you know, war is all out. You destroy the enemy's ability to fight. And that means burning farms and crops and everything else like that. All right? And what? No, not all is fair in love. And maybe all is fair in love, but in war, there are things we try to say you shouldn't do. Okay. Now, there were Israel, the early state of Israel was faced a lot of problems. The economy wasn't very good. They had lots of people who had come in, refugees to be settled, who didn't have the skills that were needed in the modern world. There was rationing. Israel was very clearly a third world state at that point, in many ways. You know, maybe getting close to a second world status, but it was a third world status. There were attacks from time to time by various groups. The Fedayeen would attack from Jordan, and Israeli would reprisals against them. And then came what was known as the Suez Crisis in 1956. Without going into the details of it, France and Britain invade Egypt to take control of the Suez Canal. Israel, in collaboration, attacks, takes hold of the entire Sinai Peninsula, trying to prevent the Fedayeen attacking. The United States tells everybody, get the hell out of there. And everybody eventually does. But there was an agreement to post peacekeeping forces in the Sinai to keep Israel and Egypt separated from each other to prevent fighting. There was supposed to be allowance for Israeli shipping to go through the Suez Canal. There were many Canadians, a lot of Canadians were involved with this, stationed at Sharm el-Sheikh, which is one of the narrowest points where the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, I guess it is, flows into the Red Sea. Red Sea, it's down there. Saudi Arabia on one side, the Sinai Peninsula on the other, and it's very easy to blockade there if you want. The Egyptians never lived up to the permission for shipping to go through the Suez Canal, but they left the peacekeeping troops there. In 1964, the PLO is founded, Palestine Liberation Organization, right? We're talking about 18 years, 16 years after the State of Israel was created. Remember, at this time, the West Bank, which was part of Palestine, was under Jordanian rule. It was annexed by Jordan. So there is various kinds of conflict beginning. The Egyptians mobilized their forces in Sinai. Syrians shell northern Israel. And finally, both Syria and Egypt demand that the peacekeeping troops leave. And they threaten to blockade Sharm el-Sheikh, which is Israeli shipping needs to go out through that way to get to the east. And so the Israeli army attacks the Air Force. Israeli Air Force wipes out both the Egyptian and Syrian forces, and it's known as the 6-Day War because it took 6 days for Israel to reconquer the Sinai Peninsula and take what is known as the Golan Heights, which, remember that Sykes-Picot agreement that was not clear where the line was supposed to be drawn there in the first place. Israel tells King Hussein, who's the king then of Jordan, stay out of the fighting, we'll leave you alone. Presumably he listened to the Egyptian and Syrian propaganda, which claimed how they were massacring the Israeli forces. So he too entered into the fighting. And so as a result, the entire West Bank, including Jerusalem and its environs, were conquered by the State of Israel. This is 67. And this created a huge impact in the Jewish world. Before the war broke out, and I was a teenager then, Israel was being threatened. There's great fear that Israel would not be able to overcome the forces at this time. And so when Israel not only wins, but wins in short order and decisive victory, there was a lot of enthusiasm for Israel that came to the fore. There was a lot of Jewish pride that had not been exhibited before. I'll come back to that in a minute. And there was a almost messianic fervor amongst the certain elements of the Israeli population, a desire to settle the entire land of Israel, beginning of settlements, sometimes under government support. There was originally an idea that they would set a line of settlements all along the Jordan River to prevent any time of a attack from Jordan. The old city of Jerusalem was reestablished as a Jewish settlement area. The section that had been part of the Jewish section of Jerusalem was rebuilt. The area in front of the Kotel HaMaravi, the Western Wall, was plowed, was bulldozed so that you could have access to the Western Wall, which has remained as a very important place in Jerusalem. There was a lot of hope for what the future would bring. But once again, there was no peace treaty. There was still a degree of tension that existed, and the PLO starts to begin its attacks on why today you can't fly on an airplane, go see the pilots and everything like that, and the doors are barred and what have you. In Black skyjackings, 1972, 11 Israeli athletes are massacred at the Munich Olympics. And then in 1973, you have what is called the Yom Kippur War, the October 6th through 24th of 1973. And Israel almost lost. It was the Israeli Air Force, which was so powerful in the past, was very much affected by Russian arms to the Syrians and Egyptians anti-aircraft missiles. And until they could find a way around it, it looks pretty bad. The Egyptian army had crossed the Suez Canal. They broke through what the Israelis thought would hold them back. They made great inroads into the Sinai Peninsula, and there was a lot of panic. But once Israel was able to take control of the air again, the tide turned. The Syrian tanks that had gone from the north, making a breakthrough into northern Israel, were stopped and beaten back. Ariel Sharon, who was the general in charge of the forces in Suez, not only encircled the Egyptian army, he crossed the Suez Canal and was on the western side of the Suez Canal. So both Damascus and Cairo were within Israeli approaches to the war. There was once again, there was a armistice. There was various aspects of terrorism during the following years. In 1977 was a watershed in Israeli politics. It was when Likud came to power, led by Menachem Begin, the first non-labor, socialist-led government. And then Anwar Sadat visits Jerusalem. Many thinkers suggest that since the Egyptians had done so well, at least at the beginning of the fighting, they could reclaim their pride. They bloodied the nose of Israel. And so that made the possibility of making peace with Israel a possibility. And indeed, that's what happens, is that Sadat and Begin sign a peace treaty. Egypt did very well by it, got all the Sinai Peninsula back. It did not want Gaza. Who would want Gaza? So that was still in Israeli hands. but everything else was returned, and the Gaza, Suez was demilitarized. There was going to be no Egyptian forces, and if they had to go in there, they had to talk to Israelis in advance to deal with issues that were there. In the late 80s, we had what is known as the Intifada. First Intifada, which breaks out with rioting in Gaza. And then in 1989 through 91, you have a mass aliyah from the Soviet Union beginning. And this was the largest aliyah ever to Israel. And it had a huge impact on Israel. In many ways, it brought in a lot of scientists. It brought in various elements that were helpful in moving the state of Israel forward. It brought in many Jews who were married to non-Jews, and their children were not necessarily recognized as Jewish by the state, and all the problems that that's created since then. Just to go over real swiftly, because we're not going to spend time anymore with it, you've had since the 1990s various attempts to create some kind of a deal between the Palestinian Arabs and the Israel state. In 1993, there was a signing of a declaration of principles between Israel and the PLO. That was supposed to begin the first steps towards Palestinian self-control, self-rule. Parts worked, parts did not. Israel never gave up full over control to everything, but there is a part of what was conquered by Israel in 1967 that is completely under Palestinian control. There are parts that are sort of shared control, but things have been breaking down. When you look at the political issues, and this will spend a little more time before I let you go, what has happened in the last 20 years or so, Israel had a very miserable experience in Lebanon. They went in, again, to stop terrorists, and it was a disaster in many ways for Israel, a lot of deaths that were not necessary, and missteps by Israelis, one of which ended up with the massacre, the Shatia massacre, in which was not done by Israelis, but was enabled to take place by Israel's lack of proper response. Let's call it that. But in the meantime, Israel has prospered far above beyond anything that people had expected. I had the unique experience of going to Israel right after the Six-Day War. I was a teenager. We had a trip that was planned to go to Israel before the war. And then after the war was over, I got to go on this trip. It wasn't a bad trip, met my wife.
That's nice.
Yes. Actually, I'm one of three boys. I have two sisters, but the three boys all either met their wives in Israel, got married in Israel, had a connection. So we are on the love and marriage aspect of things. Israel's been good to us. But when I went to Israel then in '67, it was mostly a poor country. If you wanted to call overseas, you had to go to the post office and use a phone in the post office, and believe me, it was very expensive. Many people didn't have their own telephones. Hardly anybody had televisions. There weren't a lot of private cars. Today, Israel is a bustling, first-class, first-world country. And in the areas of computers and in electronic creativity, Israel has made tremendous strides. And we know that so much that is out there is a result of ingenuity coming out of Israel. Lots of cars, lots of traffic jams. What?
The specific part, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's lots of things in cell phones that Israel's been responsible for, the creativity. They've done a lot in agriculture. The drip irrigation was a wonderful methodology they came up with. That means you don't waste water. They are able to desalinate water in large measures to supply their water supplies. But because of that, you also have this issue of the occupation. And depending upon your viewpoint, you look at this story and you say, here you have Goliath. In this case, it's Israel's the Goliath. And the Arab Palestinians are the Davids, overwhelmed by this huge force who interferes everything in their life. They can't go anywhere without roadblocks. They can't do X, Y, and Z. The roadblock, and again, I'm not trying to defend every action that Israel has done. I would agree that there's some mistakes they've made. But here's the issue that people overlook. Let's take this BDS thing, to boycott Israel. What is the game? What is the aim? What is the desire? Let's say we boycott Israel, and you don't stop boycotting Israel until what? That's the first question. Somebody says, what do you want? What do you see as the solution? If they say as a binational state, one country, first of all, it'll end up being Palestine, not Israel. You'll be wiping out the Jewish aspects of it. Look at every other country in the Middle East with large minorities and what's happened to them when the others are in power. Israel may be a somewhat flawed democracy, but no more flawed than the United States. What other country in the Middle East is really a democracy? And then look what happened when Israel did pull out of Gaza. Israel went out of its way. It forced all the Jewish settlers out of Gaza Strip. It removed any and all Israeli control over anything inside Gaza. And what happened? They end up voting for Hamas. They end up shooting rockets into Israel. And, if Israel tries to stop it, then they're invading and they're causing problems. No matter what they do, they're wrong. Well, they left greenhouse. Yes, they left some greenhouses that were very successful agricultural industry, and they just tore them apart, tore them down.
What I don't understand is that in 47 we were pro two-state, like we agreed to have their own.
Yeah, and had it come into being in 1947-48. And had the Arabs agreed to it then, we wouldn't have these issues.
Can't make peace with people that like that.
That's the problem. That's part of the problem. So yeah, I was, let's say not all of, and when you do the research, I mean, Israel's getting to be more right-wing now too, because they haven't found a solution. But if you go back 10, 15 years ago, when there was very clearly a strong, we'll call it the peace camp in Israel, lack of a better term. Why have they disappeared? Because there's no true peace camp on the Arab side. That's the problem. There's nobody really to speak. And you know, you hear the chants at the demonstrations, it's not free Palestine. It's Palestine from the river to the sea. It means no Israel. You know, who in their right mind is going to hand a loaded gun to put to your head to somebody who doesn't like it? So when those who feel Israel is in the wrong come up with a proposal that makes sense, that's doable and acceptable to both sides, then they can boycott. But until then, I don't see that they have a leg to stand on. Like I say, I'm not trying to say Israel does everything that's right. That, you know, and Israelis themselves say that not everything. They're having big arguments right now about the courts and everything in the public demonstrations, but we don't see guns being fired at demonstrators and thousands of people being put into jail and executed for disagreeing with the state. Okay. So that's where it is. So
But I think like I think there was a new like strategy. Like now I heard Netanyahu say like the new strategy for Israel is not to circle later on to Palestinians and first start making peace with the rest of the Arab world, like the Abrahamic.
Well, that's what seems to be what has happened. What has happened with the complaint is, and I see the validity in that complaint. If you want to have a Palestinian state, it has to be contiguous, at least to some degree, and not cut up into pieces. And what Israel has done is decide at least certain areas are going to stay under their control. And the suburbs of Jerusalem in the east are being surrounded by Israeli settlements, which would make it very hard for a Palestinian state. There, I think they have a legitimate argument. But again, Israel pulled out settlements from the West Bank and from Gaza. If they really believe that there was a partner for a true peace, I'm sure that some kind of modus vivendi could be created. Furthermore, well, again, I won't say it's perfect for Arab Israelis, but Arab Israelis vote, they work, they can live most of the time wherever they want. Yeah, there's prejudice, I'm not denying that, but they can live anywhere. Jews would not be allowed in a Palestinian state. So put that into the hopper.
I'm saying like eventually maybe Palestinians will be under pressure, have some kind of deal with Israel because all the Arab world is making peace with
Maybe. Oh, okay, that's what you're trying to get at.
apparently Saudi Arabia soon, when they're under the radar screen.
Maybe. I hope you're right. It'd be nice to have peace there.
It's going to come from the partnership.
Maybe. I mean, look, there are all kinds of things that could be done. There could be a demilitarized Palestinian state. There could be some kind of confederation between a Palestinian state and Israel that would provide for economic benefits to everybody. I mean, right now, the economic engine that is Israel gives jobs to Palestinians on the West Bank. What's the soda company? No. They make machines that you make soda and you put flavor in.
Oh, SodaStream.
SodaStream, right. So they boycotted SodaStream. They didn't want to. So what they do, they left the Arab land area where they were, and they had a factory there. And so they're not hiring the Arabs who live there anymore. That really was a true benefit for those who wanted to help the Palestinians out. They lost jobs. But so, like I say, there's a case to be made for the Palestinians if they're prepared to truly find a way of doing peace. I think even some of the most right-wing, it was Ariel Sharon who pulled out of Gaza. He was no lefty. There was no peacenik. And I think the moment that you have true leadership in that part of the world that really wants to make peace, you'll have it. But it doesn't exist yet. Okay, I will remind everyone by email that we will and send you the link to next week's class.
Not here.
Florida.
I will be, not Miami, Jacksonville, Florida. That, and when I was growing up, we called Jacksonville Southern Georgia. Miami was Southern Brooklyn and Jacksonville was Southern Georgia. It's because all the New Yorkers in Miami and in Jacksonville, you couldn't tell the difference between the natives and the Georgia crackers. Northeast corner, northeast. No, Tampa is on the west side of the state, on the Gulf of Mexico. Jacksonville is north, just south of Georgia. And Jacksonville Beach is on the Atlantic Ocean. Very far north, yeah. Way up there.
That's why I picture it. And you know what I mean? That's why.
It's not- when I grew up, Tampa was, I think Tampa was bigger than Jackson, I'm not sure, but Orlando was nothing. Orlando was orange groves.
Disneyland.
It didn't exist. It did not exist. Disney World. Florida's Disney World, California's Disneyland. But who knows? Soon it may be the Santa's land. I don't know.
We call it Disneylandia.
Disneylandia.
Like
Disney.
Disney.
even the commercials say like el mundo de Disney. Like, Disney, so you are thinking that it's Disney.
Disney?
But if you back to get the Disney, so the Disney World. Have
It
it.
comes to my.
I don't know what would happen. All right. Good night, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks,
Have
Rabbi.
a good
Have a
one.
good trip.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much,
Have a
Rabbi.
great trip.
All right, bye.